The United States Senate has advanced a resolution that would require President Donald Trump to seek congressional authorization before escalating military operations in Venezuela. The measure, introduced by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, passed with bipartisan support, including 5 Republican senators who joined Democrats in voting to assert legislative oversight over executive military authority.
A resolution put forth by Virginia Senator Tim Kaine to limit future military force in Venezuela without congressional approval. 5 Republicans voted with Democrats to limit the president's powers less than a week after Nicolas Maduro was captured. Those in support say there needs to be a debate on this military operation.
What you will likely see next week is a vote on a motion to proceed, which we would expect simple majority, similar vote to today, and then a debate, finally, after months, about this military operation, the whole thing, including where it's going in Venezuela and possibly in other nations.
On the flip side, Republicans who voted against the resolution say it puts America's safety at risk.
I respect their decision. They're dead wrong. There'll be plenty of people here to make sure this doesn't happen. They're going to own screwing up the best chance we've ever had to liberate the people of Venezuela and make our...
The vote comes less than 1 week following the capture of Nicolas Maduro, the former Venezuelan leader, and represents a significant moment of congressional assertion on matters of war and military engagement. Supporters of the resolution argue that any sustained military operation requires formal debate and authorization from the legislative branch, as outlined in the Constitution and the War Powers Act of 1973. Senators who voted in favor of the measure emphasized the constitutional obligation of Congress to oversee military commitments. The resolution does not immediately restrict current operations, but sets in motion a process that could lead to further constraints on the administration's ability to expand military engagement without legislative approval.
The U.S. Senate just advanced a resolution that would limit President Trump's ability to conduct further attacks against Venezuela. Democrats and 5 Republicans voted in favor of the War Powers resolution. Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed is live for us on Capitol Hill. And Nate, this is sending a big message to the Trump administration. But what comes next?
Yeah, Holly, but this is pretty much exactly that. It's a message to the Trump administration. This is not something that will really limit the ability for President Trump to continue U.S. involvement in Venezuela in the southern hemisphere. There's a lot of questions about just exactly what this will accomplish, other than sending that message to the White House that not just Democrats, but a handful of Republicans are, have concerns about what direction this conflict could be going, as the Trump administration has repeatedly refused to rule out any further use of military force on the ground in Venezuela as they look to set up a government.
Legislative observers expect a motion to proceed on the resolution next week, which would likely pass by a simple majority similar to the initial vote. This would open the door to a formal debate on the administration's military operations in Venezuela and potentially other nations, marking the first comprehensive congressional discussion of the conflict after months of executive-led engagement. The 5 Republican senators who supported the resolution, Josh Hawley of Missouri, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Susan Collins of Maine, and Todd Young of Indiana, represent a cross-section of the party's ideological spectrum. Their votes reflect varying motivations, from constitutional principle to concerns about the direction and scope of the administration's foreign policy. Hawley, who has generally aligned with the administration on domestic policy, joined the vote on constitutional grounds. Paul, a consistent advocate for limiting executive war powers, continued his long-standing position on military authorization. Murkowski and Collins, both known for independent voting records on constitutional matters, maintained their pattern of prioritizing institutional oversight over party alignment. Young's participation signaled broader concerns within the party about unchecked military expansion. The vote has drawn sharp responses from both supporters and opponents. Proponents argue that congressional authorization is a fundamental requirement for sustained military action, not an obstacle to effective foreign policy. They contend that the War Powers Resolution process represents one of Congress's essential tools for maintaining constitutional balance in matters of national security. Critics of the resolution, primarily within the Republican Party, maintain that such constraints could limit the president's ability to respond to emerging threats and protect American interests abroad. They argue that requiring congressional approval for rapid military responses could create dangerous delays during critical security situations. The legislative maneuvering around this resolution highlights ongoing tensions between the executive and legislative branches regarding war powers. The Constitution grants Congress the sole authority to declare war, while designating the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This dual allocation of authority has generated decades of debate about the precise boundaries of each branch's role in initiating and sustaining military operations. The War Powers Act of 1973 was enacted specifically to clarify these boundaries following the Vietnam War, when concerns grew about presidential commitment of forces without explicit congressional authorization. The law requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action, and forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days with a further 30-day withdrawal period without congressional authorization or a declaration of war. Despite its passage over 5 decades ago, the War Powers Act has rarely been invoked in a manner that successfully constrains presidential military action. Presidents from both parties have historically resisted its constraints, and Congress has often been reluctant to force confrontations over military operations. The current resolution represents a rare instance of legislative willingness to assert these authorities in a meaningful way. The timing of this vote carries particular significance. With military operations in Venezuela ongoing and the administration refusing to rule out further ground operations, senators supporting the resolution have framed their vote as preventive rather than reactionary. They argue that establishing clear congressional oversight now could prevent deeper military entanglement without proper authorization later. The resolution's advancement also occurs against a backdrop of broader foreign policy debates within the Republican Party. Recent discussions about military engagements have revealed varying perspectives on the appropriate scope of American intervention abroad, with some members advocating for more restrained approaches, while others emphasize robust projection of military power. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has indicated that the resolution will move through regular order, with opportunities for amendment and debate. This procedural commitment suggests that the Senate intends to conduct a thorough examination of the administration's Venezuela policy, rather than simply registering symbolic opposition. The House of Representatives has not yet taken up companion legislation, and the path to final passage remains uncertain. However, the Senate vote has already achieved one significant outcome, demonstrating that bipartisan majorities can form around constitutional oversight of military action, even in an era of intense partisan polarization. As the resolution proceeds, both the administration and congressional leadership will need to navigate complex political dynamics. The president's response to the vote, including direct engagement with Republican senators, has underscored the high stakes involved in this institutional confrontation. How these interactions evolve may shape not only the outcome of this specific resolution, but also the broader relationship between the executive branch and Congress on national security matters for the remainder of this term. Following the Senate vote on the War Powers Resolution, President Trump engaged in direct communication with the 5 Republican senators who supported the measure. According to multiple sources familiar with the conversations, the president expressed strong disapproval of their votes and indicated potential political consequences for their decision to break with the administration on this issue. The president's response included public statements suggesting that these senators should face primary challenges in future elections and characterizing their votes as undermining American security and his authority as commander-in-chief. The communications focused on political loyalty rather than substantive policy or legal arguments regarding the constitutional merits of the resolution. This approach to intra-party dissent represents a notable departure from traditional presidential engagement with congressional allies. Typically, administrations seeking to maintain legislative support employ a combination of policy persuasion, negotiation on specific provisions, and appeals to party unity. The direct threat of electoral consequences for constitutional votes marks a different model of executive-legislative relations. Senators who receive these communications have responded with varying degrees of public comment. Some have defended their votes as consistent with their constitutional obligations, while others have sought to minimize public confrontation with the administration. All five have maintained their positions on the resolution itself, suggesting that the president's response has not altered their substantive stance on war powers. The confrontation has generated discussion among legal scholars and political observers about the appropriate boundaries of presidential influence over legislative votes. While presidents have historically worked to build coalitions for their preferred policies, the explicit framing of constitutional votes as tests of personal loyalty raises questions about institutional norms and the separation of powers. Constitutional scholars note that Article 1 of the Constitution explicitly vests war-making authority in Congress, while Article 2 designates the President as Commander-in-Chief. The framers' intention in this division was to prevent unilateral executive military action while preserving the President's ability to respond to immediate threats. The current debate reflects ongoing tensions in interpreting these provisions in the context of modern military operations. The President's response to the War Powers vote occurred concurrently with another development that drew significant attention from legal observers. The Department of Justice displayed signage at its Washington headquarters featuring a portrait of President Trump alongside the slogan, "Make America Safe Again," a variation of his political campaign messaging. The display prompted immediate reaction from former Justice Department officials, legal scholars, and government ethics experts. Many noted that the Department of Justice has historically maintained visual and operational independence from individual presidents' political branding. The department's traditional iconography emphasizes institutional identity rather than personal association with current office holders. Legal historians and former prosecutors expressed concern that associating the department so directly with a specific president's political identity could undermine public perception of prosecutorial independence. The Department of Justice's credibility depends in part on the appearance that prosecutorial decisions are based on evidence and legal standards rather than political considerations. The juxtaposition of these two developments, the response to senators and the Justice Department display, has generated analysis about broader patterns in the administration's approach to institutional independence. Critics argue that both incidents reflect efforts to reduce the distance between the president's personal political interests and institutions traditionally expected to maintain some separation from individual office holders. Supporters of the administration counter that the Justice Department display represents appropriate presidential leadership of executive agencies and that engagement with senators on legislative votes falls within normal political activity. They note that previous administrations have also worked to advance their policy preferences through various forms of political pressure and institutional messaging. The debate over these matters extends beyond immediate partisan considerations. Former officials from both Democratic and Republican administrations have weighed in, with many expressing concern about long-term institutional impacts. The specific imagery and methods employed have drawn particular attention because they appear to depart from established practices that previous administrations of both parties have generally maintained. Senate Republicans have displayed varying responses to the situation. Some have defended the president's right to engage with senators on legislative matters, while others have expressed concern about the tone and methods employed. The range of reactions suggests that the party has not reached consensus on how to navigate the current institutional dynamics. The confrontation also occurs within a broader context of Republican Party dynamics regarding foreign policy and executive authority. Recent debates about military engagements have revealed evolving perspectives within the party on the appropriate balance between presidential flexibility and congressional oversight. The Venezuela vote represents one manifestation of these internal discussions. Political analysts suggest that the president's approach to dissent within his party could influence future legislative dynamics. If senators conclude that constitutional votes carry significant political costs, the frequency of such votes may decrease. Conversely, if senators determine that institutional principles outweigh political risks, the effectiveness of pressure tactics may diminish over time. The coming weeks will likely see continued engagement between the administration and congressional Republicans on these matters. The resolution's progression through the Senate will provide further indication of whether the current coalition of support can be maintained or expanded, and how the administration adjusts its legislative strategy in response. The Senate vote on Venezuela war powers and subsequent developments have highlighted evolving dynamics within the Republican Party regarding executive authority and foreign policy. While President Trump has historically maintained strong influence over Republican elected officials, recent events suggest potential shifts in how party members navigate constitutional questions and policy disagreements. The 5 senators who supported the War Powers Resolution represent different factions within the party. Josh Hawley has generally aligned with populist conservative positions on domestic issues while maintaining an independent streak on institutional matters. Rand Paul has consistently advocated for libertarian-leaning foreign policy positions and limitations on executive power. Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins have established records of breaking with party leadership on issues they view as fundamental to constitutional process. Todd Young brings national security experience from his service on relevant committees. Their collective decision to support the resolution suggests that concerns about unchecked military expansion transcend traditional ideological categories within the party. The vote indicates that constitutional oversight of war powers can generate bipartisan coalitions, even in periods of intense partisan polarization. Media commentators who have traditionally supported the administration's agenda have also expressed reservations about recent military escalations. Figures including Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and Matt Walsh have publicly questioned the alignment of certain foreign interventions with America First principles. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has similarly raised concerns about military commitments abroad. These media voices differ from the Senate votes in their practical impact. While media commentary shapes public discourse and political narratives, Senate votes directly affect legislative outcomes and institutional checks on executive power. The combination of media criticism and legislative action, however, creates a multifaceted environment of scrutiny for the administration's foreign policy. Senate institutional action carries particular weight because it represents the legislative branch exercising its constitutional authority in a manner that directly constrains executive options. This is precisely the function that the separation of powers was designed to serve, allowing different branches to check each other when members believe constitutional boundaries are being tested. The president's characterization of the war powers vote as disloyalty rather than legitimate legislative oversight has generated discussion about the nature of congressional obligations. Senators swear an oath to uphold the Constitution rather than to support specific administrations, a distinction that constitutional scholars emphasize in discussions of legislative independence. The Hill reported in February 2026 that some Republicans were increasingly concerned about the electoral implications of the administration's approach to institutional norms and foreign policy. These concerns reflect calculations about whether unconditional alignment with the administration serves long-term political interests, particularly as public opinion on specific military engagements evolves. Electoral considerations may influence legislative behavior, regardless of individual senators' personal views on constitutional matters. When political costs of supporting administration positions appear to exceed benefits, legislators may adjust their voting patterns accordingly. The current environment suggests that such calculations are becoming more complex for some Republican members. The Supreme Court's recent 6-3 ruling, striking down certain tariff authorities, which included votes against administration positions by 2 justices appointed by President Trump, further illustrates institutional dynamics. Judicial independence from political pressure, even when appointees are involved, demonstrates the continuing operation of constitutional checks. Similarly, career Justice Department officials who have raised concerns about legal processes represent another layer of institutional oversight. These officials operate within executive agencies but maintain professional obligations to legal standards that may differ from political preferences. The cumulative effect of these developments suggests an environment where multiple institutions are simultaneously asserting independence from executive preferences. This pattern differs from earlier periods of the administration, where institutional resistance was more isolated and episodic. Republican senators face complex calculations about how to navigate this environment. Supporting the administration on policy matters while maintaining institutional independence on constitutional questions requires careful positioning. The current vote suggests that at least some members believe such balancing is possible and necessary. The historical context of war powers debates provides important perspective. The War Powers Act emerged from Vietnam-era concerns about presidential military escalation without congressional input. Subsequent decades have seen repeated tensions between executive flexibility and legislative oversight, with varying degrees of congressional willingness to assert authority. Current events represent a notable instance of congressional assertion because they involve members of the president's own party supporting constraints on his military authority. Such cross-party support for institutional oversight has been relatively rare in recent decades, making this vote particularly significant for understanding current political dynamics. The resolution's practical effects remain limited in the immediate term. It does not withdraw current forces or directly halt ongoing operations. However, its passage signals congressional intent to exercise oversight and establishes precedent for future constraints on military expansion without authorization. As the resolution moves through further legislative stages, the administration's response and Republican senators' continued positioning will clarify whether this represents an isolated instance of dissent or the beginning of broader institutional reassertion. The outcome will influence not only Venezuela policy, but also the broader framework of executive-legislative relations on national security matters. The recent Senate vote on war powers and the Justice Department signage have prompted extensive analysis from legal scholars, former government officials, and institutional experts about the state of executive branch relations and the durability of governmental norms. These discussions extend beyond immediate political controversies to questions about the long-term functioning of American democratic institutions. The Department of Justice's traditional role in American governance depends significantly on public perception of its independence from political influence. Federal prosecutors exercise substantial discretion in charging decisions, investigation priorities, and legal interpretations. The legitimacy of these decisions rests partly on the appearance that they reflect legal judgment rather than political direction. When justice institutions become visually or symbolically associated with specific political figures, this perception of independence may erode. Defense attorneys can cite such associations in challenging prosecutorial decisions. Foreign governments may question the objectivity of American legal processes. Domestic public confidence in equal application of law may diminish. These effects are not merely theoretical. Legal systems in other nations have demonstrated how politicization of justice institutions can undermine rule of law over time. When law enforcement becomes associated with particular leaders rather than legal standards, the foundation for consistent, predictable justice weakens. The specific imagery employed at the Justice Department, featuring the president's portrait alongside campaign-style messaging, departed from established practices. Previous administrations have generally maintained institutional branding that emphasizes the department's role as an enduring governmental entity rather than an extension of current political leadership. Career officials within the Justice Department and other agencies operate under professional ethical obligations that may conflict with political directives. Recent reports of attorneys raising concerns about legal processes in immigration cases illustrate tensions between professional standards and administrative preferences. How these tensions are resolved has significant implications for institutional integrity. The Senate's role in this broader institutional landscape involves maintaining legislative oversight of executive actions, including military operations. The Constitution's allocation of war powers to Congress reflects the framers' determination that major military commitments should receive deliberative approval rather than unilateral executive decision. When senators exercise this oversight authority, even against administration preferences, they fulfill a constitutional function that transcends partisan considerations. The 5 Republicans who supported the War Powers Resolution acted within this tradition, regardless of their specific motivations or the political consequences they may face. The President's response to this legislative action, including direct engagement with senators and public statements about electoral consequences, represents one model of executive-legislative relations. Alternative approaches might emphasize policy persuasion, negotiation on resolution language, or acceptance of legitimate institutional disagreement. How these interactions evolve may establish precedents for future administrations of either party. If legislative oversight of war powers becomes routinely subject to personal political retaliation, the effectiveness of constitutional checks may diminish. If legislators determine that institutional principles warrant accepting such risks, oversight mechanisms may strengthen. The current moment features multiple institutions simultaneously navigating these tensions. Courts continue issuing rulings that constrain administrative actions. Congress considers legislation limiting executive military authority. Career officials maintain professional standards within agencies. Media figures debate policy directions within ideological coalitions. This multiplicity of institutional voices differs from more centralized models of governance, where executive authority faces fewer internal constraints. The American system's design intentionally creates friction between branches, requiring negotiation and compromise rather than unilateral action. The question facing observers is whether current institutional resistance represents temporary friction or sustainable assertion of constitutional boundaries. Historical patterns suggest that American institutions have generally maintained their core functions despite periods of intense political pressure, though specific norms and practices may evolve. For the remainder of the current presidential term, several pressure points seem likely to generate continued institutional engagement. Military operations in Venezuela and potential other theaters will test congressional willingness to assert war powers. Justice Department operations will continue, raising questions about prosecutorial independence. Judicial appointments and rulings will shape the legal framework within which administration actions occur. The individuals who have demonstrated institutional independence, senators voting against administration preferences, career officials raising legal concerns, judges ruling against governmental positions, face personal and professional consequences for their actions. Their decisions reflect calculations about the importance of institutional integrity relative to personal cost. Whether such calculations spread to additional officials and office holders will significantly influence the trajectory of institutional relations. If resistance remains isolated, executive authority may expand. If it becomes more widespread, traditional constitutional balances may reassert themselves. The resolution currently before the Senate represents one specific instance of these broader dynamics. Its passage would not immediately transform executive-legislative relations, but it would contribute to a pattern of congressional assertion that could cumulatively reshape expectations about military authorization. As debate continues, both supporters and opponents of the resolution are making arguments that extend beyond Venezuela policy to fundamental questions about American governance. The outcome will provide indication of how current institutional tensions are being resolved and what patterns may emerge in coming months and years. The durability of governmental institutions depends ultimately on the willingness of individuals within those institutions to maintain their integrity under pressure. Recent events have demonstrated that such willingness persists across political affiliations and institutional roles, even in challenging political environments. How this willingness translates into sustained institutional practice remains the central question for observers of American governance.